All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. It's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces and also meet so many new ones. I feel really humbled and honored to be giving a talk today about some recent work that I've been doing with some collaborators up here, in particular Netta Weinstein. And we've been doing some recent studies on regulating problematic behavior and how autonomy-supportive strategies can be really helpful to doing that. And so I'm going to be talking to you guys about two types of problematic behaviors that we've been working on. The first is on cyberbullying. And we wondered, can autonomy-supportive parenting strategies actually help to regulate cyberbullying behaviors among their children? And then in a second study I'm going to be talking about, we wondered, about a much more pervasive problem. And this is the problem of prejudice in policing. And we wondered, does having an autonomy-supportive police force actually predict less bias and less prejudice within policing? Okay, so first I'm going to talk about cyberbullying. And so this is a growing problem among youth. And it's defined as intentional aggression towards a victim who can't easily defend themselves. And importantly, it occurs via electronic contact, so through social media, texting, Facebook, things like that. And cyberbullying often co-occurs with traditional bullying or face-to-face bullying. So much so that researchers have said that cyberbullying is basically just a new bottle but old wine. And we know from research in cyberbullying and traditional bullying that both perpetrators and victims suffer in terms of things like greater depression, greater suicidality, among other sorts of bad outcomes that they face. So it's bad for them, for both parties. But very little is known about how to regulate or intervene to reduce this problem behavior. And so because this is what many of us like to study, we kind of think of autonomy support as the silver bullet. We wondered, can autonomy-supportive parenting strategies actually help to regulate this type of behavior? And so I'm not going to go into this too much. I'm pretty sure everyone in this room is a bit familiar with how to support autonomy. But just so we're on the same page, supporting autonomy in the context of parenting is about accepting children as they are. It's about seeing your child's perspective, really trying to understand their point of view. And when it comes to cyberbullying, understanding why they may have done that. Supporting their interests whenever possible, offering choices to kids, and minimizing the use of control, so making demands of them, and shaming them, using controlling language. Control, so when parents use control, they pressure their kids to appear or behave in certain ways. And they can do this through a lot of different tactics, so using threats, using shame and guilt, demanding language, and being evaluative and critical of their kids. And so why do we think that autonomy support would work better to help regulate cyberbullying behavior among kids? So for one, it helps kids internalize parents' rules and values. And what's a really common value that just about every parent teaches their kid? I'm actually asking. Be kind, be nice. The golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would want done to yourself. So be kind, be nice. And so if this is a value that most parents are giving to their kids, being autonomy supportive is actually going to help them to internalize it or buy into it more. So because of this increased buy-in, autonomy support tends to be more successful than control in actually getting that thing that you want from your kids or producing the desired outcomes. So for example, really relevant to this work, Research by Martin and Chris and Bart has shown that prohibiting teens from affiliating with a deviant peer actually works better when you're more autonomy supportive. And so this was really relevant to us because it also shows that autonomy support is not just allowing kids to do whatever the heck they want. You actually can be prohibitive as long as you do it in an autonomy supportive way, and it'll work better. And we also know from previous research that controlling messages can backfire. And not only are they less effective, but they can actually increase the behavior that you don't want them to do. And we know this from work such as work trying to limit screen time with kids. And so the big reason that autonomy supportive strategies tend to work better is because they actually reduce reactance in teens and in really any population you're studying. And this is the desire to do the opposite of request. I think of it kind of like the screw you effect, right? I'm not going to do what you're telling me to do. And so autonomy support can be really helpful in minimizing this, especially in teenagers who might really want to behave in this way. And so we set out to test these hypotheses, and what we did is we pre-registered them. And so I just want to see who in this room is familiar with the idea of pre-registration. Yay, good. So lots of you guys are familiar with pre-registration, but for those that are not, it's basically setting hypotheses and your analytic strategy in stone. So declaring it before you've collected the data and before you've looked at analyses. And this is a really critical reform within open science to try to make our science a little more robust and reproducible. We're going to be talking about this a lot more in the brainstorming session tomorrow if you guys are interested. But it's basically saying to the world, declaring, these are our hypotheses, and they're a priori. They're not, manipulated after the fact, after we've seen the data. Pardon. And so we hypothesized that parents who use autonomy supportive strategies to regulate their kids' cyberbullying behavior would have adolescents who actually reported lower cyberbullying behavior. So we thought that it would work better. And the reason that it would work better is because it would lower the reactance to parent messages. And we also thought that parents who used controlling strategies to regulate their kids' cyberbullying behavior would have adolescents who reported more engagement in cyberbullying. And this was because of greater reactance. So we basically just hypothesized the opposite. And so this was a study that Andy Shabilsky collected. It was an awesome nationally representative sample of about 1,000 teens and their parents who were living in the UK. And so the sample was pretty much split between 14 and 15-year-olds, split basically down the middle by gender, and moms tended to be the caregiver that responded to the survey more than dads. And so the procedure was that it was an online survey, and the parent first completed the survey, and then they left the room and let the teenager complete the survey after that. And so first I'm going to take you through the teenage measures. So first of all, kids completed, I'm going to be using kids and teenagers kind of interchangeably, but they completed the cyberbullying scale. And this is asking, how much engagement in cyberbullying were these kids up to in the past 6 months? And so for example, they were asked a question like, how often have you tried to keep others from liking someone by texting or posting mean things about them? And they responded in terms of not at all in the past 6 months to several times a week. And so luckily, in this sample, across all these different behaviors, cyberbullying behavior was reported as very low, and that's a good thing. then kids were asked about reactance to parent messages. And so they were given the prompt, when my mom or dad wants me to act in a certain way, like being nice to others, these conversations make me feel like I want to do exactly the opposite. The parent survey focused mainly around a questionnaire that we modified from the GCOS. And so we kind of blended the GCOS along with the cyberbullying scale that their kids filled out to have parents look at these different vignettes or these different kinds of cyberbullying situations and then answer, how would they react? And we had both autonomy-supportive and controlling items for each of these different scenarios. So for example, how would you react if your child, you notice that your child put down a schoolmate on social media? And an example of an autonomy support reaction would be I'd try to understand the way my child feels about the situation. And a controlling reaction would be I would shame my child for his or her behavior. And then we asked parents, how concerned are you that your kid is currently engaged in cyberbullying? And this matched up really nicely to kids' reports of their own cyberbullying engagement. So we saw a correlation of almost 0.5, so really robust correlation, meaning parents seem to be doing a pretty good job of knowing when their kids were up to no good. Okay. So I'm going to take you through first the confirmatory analyses that we did. And this is just the test of the way that we pre-registered our hypotheses. We did it exactly like we said we'd do it ahead of time. And so what we see is that the more that parents were using autonomy-supportive strategies, the less their kids were engaged in cyberbullying. And so this was awesome. This was a medium effect size. We were very happy. And we saw a nice mediation through reactance. So the reason that kids were engaged in less cyberbullying when parents were autonomy supportive, it's because it lowered their reactance to those parent messages. Okay, but then we saw kind of a scary result where controlling parenting strategies also predicted less adolescent cyberbullying, though we did not see any effect with reactance, so no relation to reactance. And this got us really curious why control was functioning in the same way as autonomy support. As we know, theory would predict the opposite of that. I mean, we predicted the opposite of that, as I think most of us in this room would. So what we did is we decided to look at how the items were loading. We were wondering if something curious was going on with the different facets of control. And so it turned out that the punishment aspect of control was actually loading onto the autonomy support factor. Whereas the other aspects of control, like shame and guilt, they were loading onto their own separate factor of control. And this actually made a lot of sense in the context of dealing with problem behavior. It seems like punishment might be a strategy that autonomy-supportive parents might use in a situation of some pretty negative behaviors. So we redid these analyses with control, separating out these different aspects of shame and guilt, kind of our clean factor of control as we might think of it in SDT. And then we separated out the punishment items into its own factor. And it nicely explained this discrepancy. So you can see that punishment was somewhat effective in actually reducing cyberbullying behavior. So when parents used more punishment, their kids did engage in cyberbullying less, though there was no relation with reactance, and it was a smaller effect size than we saw with autonomy-supportive items. And using strategies like shaming and guilting their kids, that did not work very well. And we actually saw when parents used those strategies, cyberbullying behavior was reported as greater in those adolescents. And we did see that shaming and guilting also related to greater reactance feelings in kids. So our worldview was restored. We were happy. And the big takeaway from this study is that autonomy-supportive parenting strategies, kind of just forget the control part of it, but the autonomy-supportive strategies were working really well. And they seem to work better than controlling strategies, even when you combine punishment and shame and guilt. And there's a big limitation to this study in that it's cross-sectional. And it seems very likely that there are probably some reciprocal effects going on, where adolescent behaviors are probably shaping parenting strategies and vice versa. And so we'd really like to track parents and their kids over time to see whether, how strong these bidirectional effects are. And finally, we'd really like to do some autonomy-supportive interventions with parents on this stuff. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about interventions at the end of the talk. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears quite a bit and talk about a second type of problematic behavior that we've been studying lately. And this is, arguably a much more pervasive, a much more severe and grave problem. And this is the problem of racial bias within policing. And so I'm, just about every week, if not more than that, a news article comes out about, a horrific shooting by a police officer, often directed at an unarmed black man. And this problem is really horrific in the United States. But I would argue, this is a problem that we see in organizations more broadly, and the world, right? There's a big problem with racial bias and all kinds of bias, and acting on those biases. So I also want to say it's a problem in the UK as well. And I say that because that's actually where we've been able to get into policing departments with the help of an amazing team led by Les Graham. We've been really fortunate to be able to go in and collect data on UK police officers. And so just to prove it, this is us on Monday. It's a really embarrassing picture, essentially of me, but we're really, really happy to be riding around with a Durham police officer. We were just there on Monday and got a really fascinating, in-depth look at what police officers go through. This is our new best friend, Terry. And so officers and police departments are facing a lot of pressure around reducing prejudice. They're really under a lot of pressure to show results in things like this. So there's a lot of pressure from the outside to reduce this, but in general within policing, there's a lot of pressure within it. It's very hierarchical, kind of rule-based, top-down chain of command. And so a side effect of this is that officers, under all these sources of pressure, may not have much buy-in to reduce prejudice, right? I kind of think of it with people reacting like, I'm not a racist. It could be a really threatening message to hear that you need to change or reduce your bias. And so there's little buy-in with officers, and there may even be backlash to these messages of you need to, get on top of your biases. And when we look at trainings, the common, the most prevalent training, and millions and millions, maybe billions of dollars have been put into trainings to help officers actually reduce bias. And the most common types of trainings that occur are unconscious bias trainings. And the idea behind this is that the goal is really to make what is unconscious conscious. So making people more aware of their biases that they hold. And the idea is that when you're aware about it, you can start to change it. But unfortunately, there's really little evidence of their effectiveness. In fact, there's not much evidence at all either way. This isn't studied that commonly in effectiveness types of studies. But the little evidence that we do have shows that, at best, there's some really small effects in the short term that are happening with people that have undergone these trainings. And so The trainings seem to be, sometimes working, but sometimes not. And at worst, these trainings might actually be increasing people's felt prejudices. So again, we have the silver bullet, well, at least in my mind, and maybe in some of our minds, about autonomy support. So why might autonomy support actually work to help reduce people's biases? So we know, I've just talked about how autonomy support really motivates people's buy-in. And this is absolutely crucial to change, not just short-term changes, but long-term changes. And so autonomy supportive messages to regulate prejudice around bias, this has actually been studied quite a lot by Nicole Legate and colleagues. And we know that this works. So when people are given autonomy supportive messages around this stuff, it really does, even in experimental studies, show good effects on prejudice reduction, while controlling messages can have the opposite effect and actually increase people's prejudices. And it seems like the reason for that might again be due to reactance, or the desire to, do the opposite of requests. And the reason is because people feel more understood and supported in having choice around what they ultimately do with their own behavior. And so we predicted that officers and staff would report lower bias when their forces communicated about prejudice in autonomy supportive ways. And also we were really interested in picking apart the different ingredients of autonomy support to see how this related to biased attitudes, because we were really interested in developing interventions, and so knowing the specific ingredients that might be more robust will help us do that, hopefully. And so a little bit about the participants and procedure in this particular study. Well, actually, we've done a lot of studies at this point, but I'm going to talk to you guys about the first two studies that we did. So the first one, we got access to over 2,500 British officers and staff. And I'm actually going to talk about the replication that we did that was pre-registered. So we did a follow-up pretty soon after that with over 1,000 officers and staff. And again, this study was pre-registered ahead of time. And so we saw a little more men in the sample than women. It was pretty split between officers and staff. And the tenure really ranged quite a bit, from people that had just joined policing to those that had been in it over 20 years. So officers and staff took an online survey. And we asked there were a lot of items in the survey, but the ones that I'm going to focus on right now asked people to think about diverse groups. And this was defined as individuals from minority races, religions, or sexual orientations, as these are protected characteristics in policing. And so we developed an autonomy support to reduce bias scale from existing autonomy supportive climate scales. And this, we developed this really trying to get at the different aspects of autonomy support. So there were 3 items from each ingredient. I'm running pretty low on time. So I'll just, highlight rationale, for example. We asked an item like, the force has clearly communicated the reasons and need for treating individuals from diverse groups in a non-biased manner. Then we asked people about their attitudes. And here we were measuring kind of more subtle measure of attitudes. And this was antagonism towards the force investing in diversity. So really seeing like, yeah, this is a problem that I want the force to focus on, that I want the force to invest in. So questions like police officers and staff from minority groups in the force demand too much at work. And so we asked this not just with respect to within the force, but as well within the community. So for example, minority groups and communities demand too much from the force. So we're really interested if this translates both to community-facing activities and feelings, but also within the force. And so results of this study, beyond the control variables up here, you'll see that each individual aspect of autonomy support predicted these biased attitudes or antagonism around diversity, with the exception of choice. So choice did not predict. However, all 4 of the other aspects of autonomy support that we measured did predict significantly and uniquely. And together, this resulted in about a medium effect size that we saw. So I'm out of time. It worked. We see that, you know, it's a pretty good predictor of lower bias among police officers and staff. And in the future, we'd really like to do this longitudinally. We'd like to examine specifically race bias because, as you could see, we looked at a lot of diverse groups, but we're really interested in kind of picking apart the different biases to make sure that this replicates across biases. And we'd like to develop autonomy-supportive interventions to be able to look at this, both by themselves, but also alongside implicit bias trainings, as so much has been invested in that already. We'd like to see, can we augment these effects a little bit? So with that, thank you so much, especially to my collaborators. I want to thank them up here. That's 2 of them together, by the way. So thank you.